Today, the word gulag is infamous, but for many years, no one outside of the Soviet Union had any idea how terrible conditions were in the Soviet system of work camps and prisons. Under Stalin, millions of people were sent to the gulags, from hardened criminals to people who did nothing more than criticize the state. When Stalin died, those prisoners thought they had a chance for freedom, and when that didn't come quickly enough, they took matters into their own hands. And the most significant of those uprisings was in a camp in a place called Kengir, which is in what is today Kazakhstan. And the heroes of the Kengir Uprising deserve to be remembered. The Gulag, as the Western world would learn to call it, has its roots in a system used by the Tsar and the Russian Empire. Though an uncommon sentence, it involved labor camps with simplified facilities compared to prisons. Banishment to Siberia also had a long history, especially for dissidents. Soviet leaders like Stalin, Lenin, and Trotsky had all been banished before the revolution. These antecedents, however, could hardly have imagined what the Gulag system would become. Even before the October Revolution, Lenin was planning obligatory work duty for wealthy capitalists, and the Civil War only made him angrier. He wrote in January 1918 that he supported the arrest of millionaire saboteurs. "I suggest sentencing them to a half year's forced labor in a mine." He was less concerned with petty crime, which he thought would fade away in the Soviet system, but thought that class and political enemies would require severe punishment. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution, many thousands of these enemies, arrested for all manner of things, were rounded up and shoved into overcrowded Tsarist prisons. The deficiencies of the chaotic remnants of the old prison system led to the creation of concentration camps, which began opening in 1918. After the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, millions of POWs were free, and the camps were simply handed over to the Cheka, Lenin's secret police and a forerunner of the KGB. The Cheka led the Red Terror, a systematic campaign meant to arrest those sabotaging the revolution. The Red Army newspaper wrote, "Without mercy, without sparing, we will kill our enemies in scores of hundreds. Let them be thousands. Let them drown themselves in their own blood." The concentration camps, called special camps, quickly filled. In 1919, there were 21 registered camps. By the end of 1920, there were 107. To what end these political prisoners and enemies were being put to work was less clear, and Soviet leaders had different ideas. Were these people supposed to be re-educated, or was their work meant to pay for the upkeep of the camps? Camp commanders often devised punishments meant to humiliate the formerly wealthy capitalists. Prisoners were used for manual labor at the battlefront during the Civil War. The camps weren't well organized or controlled at first, but foundations of the Gulag solidified in the 1920s, especially at the Solovki prison camp, which became known as the first camp of the Gulag. The primary goal was to use the labor of the prisoners for profit under the guise of re-education. After Lenin's death in 1929, Stalin seized power, and soon the Soviet government turned to making better use of the prisoners. The special camps began to become more organized and systematic in their use of prison labor. It wasn't until 1929 that the legal basis for the camps was created. On June 27, 1929, the Politburo created a system of self-supporting camps to replace much of the old prison system, at least for any prisoners who were sentenced to more than 3-year sentences. 1929 was the year that Stalin instituted his 5-year plan for rapid industrial growth. More saboteurs were arrested when goals couldn't be met, and collectivization forced peasants to move, laying the groundwork for devastating famines. A war was waged against kulaks, supposedly wealthy peasants who were killed or deported to Siberia. Between 1930 and 1933, over 2 million peasants were sent east of the Urals. 100,000 ended up in the Gulag. The state seized all grain and arrested peasants who stole to survive. Simultaneously, the Gulag system expanded. One Russian leader explained the goals of the Gulag: to remove 10,000 prisoners from places of confinement in the Russian Republic, whose labor could be better organized and used. It was important that raw material from the rural periphery be exploited to power the 5-year plan. The system would also erase the difference between ordinary and special camps, as well as between criminal and political prisoners. By 1930, all of the Soviet Union's prisoner workforce was within the Joint State Political Directorate, or OGPU, which organized the camps under a new department called the Main Administration of Corrective Labor Camps and Labor Settlements, a name which changed several times. The term Gulag comes from an abbreviation for the Russian title, Main Camp Administration. For more than 20 years, the Gulag was a tool of repression, where prisoners convicted for all manner of crimes, real or political, were held and forced to work. As many as 18 million people passed through the camps, many of them released while around 1.5 million or more are thought to have died in the camps or shortly after release. And then on March 5th, 1953, Stalin died. Those trapped in the Gulag had long awaited his death, knowing that the whole system was tied to him. In some camps, prisoners rejoiced. One prisoner greeted another by saying, "I wish you great joy on this day of resurrection." Another exclaimed, "Soon it will be daylight in Holy Russia." Lavrenti Beria, NKVD chief, initially took over the country, and he made significant changes in his short tenure. He argued that many of the 2.5 million inmates in the Gulag should be released and extended a general amnesty to prisoners with sentences shorter than 5 years, pregnant women, women with young children, and minors. The amnesty didn't extend to political prisoners. Beria came to a bad end by the end of 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev was elected first secretary. The amnesty also affected immediate change in the camps, where prisoners began to protest more often and the administration relaxed rules. Hope in the camps grew enormously. Prisoners began organizing, becoming brazenly anti-Soviet, hiding poetry, letters, and information about the camps with the faith that they could one day be recovered. Prisoners began murdering informers, so many that it became such an ordinary occurrence that no one was surprised or interested. Strikes became more common, and in 1953 2 camps revolted in the most serious events yet, and numerous prisoners were killed to quell the disturbance. In the spring of 1954, a series of incidents at the Steplog camp near the village of Kengir in modern Kazakhstan would incite the most serious rebellion yet. After Stalin's death, reports from the Steplog camp were filled with reports of underground organizations, a crisis facing their informer network, and incidents of unrest. The guards responded with violence. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who brought attention to the event in the Gulag archipelago, believed that the violence was not just a response, but a provocation by the guards and administration, who feared for their jobs if the Gulag system ended. Multiple people were killed by guards in 1953 and 54. There were around 20,000 prisoners at Kengir, around half of them Ukrainians, and many of those Ukrainians were former partisans. Around a quarter were Balts from the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, and Poles. Moscow advised the camp to separate the Ukrainians and Balts from the rest of the population, but the camp either couldn't or wouldn't. In the first half of 1954, the camp brought in several hundred new prisoners, criminals or so-called thieves, and ordered them to provoke fights with the political prisoners. Instead, the two groups agreed to cooperate. The Ukrainians were well organized. They formed a center, a secret group which led resistance, and was probably made up of members of the other nationalities as well. The center was already making weapons when the thieves arrived. The camp was rectangular and separated into several smaller camps with walls between them. On May 16th, prisoners destroyed the stone wall, which separated the camp from the others, as well as the camp's workshops. One of the separate camps was the women's camp, which was filled like the male camp with Ukrainian partisans. Guards opened fire on the prisoners, killing 13. That night, the prisoners took control of much of the camp, breaking into the isolation cells, seizing the warehouses, workshops, and kitchen. By May 19th, most of the camp was on strike. A delegation was sent from Moscow to negotiate, and they promised to investigate the shootings, speed up re-examination of the prisoners' cases, and leave the walls open. The prisoners, satisfied, went back to work. When they came back from their shift, they found the destroyed wall rebuilt. Around 5,000 prisoners were in the 3 camp divisions. With makeshift weapons, they chased the guards out of the camp. The guards kept the camp surrounded, but initially did little else. They expected the camps to descend into anarchy, and they were surprised when the prisoners organized a surprisingly effective government. This included a strike committee to negotiate with the authorities. While the Ukrainians made up the core of the strike committee was multinational and specifically had a Russian leader, Colonel Kapitan Kuznetsov. Kuznetsov was a former Red Army officer in prison for allegedly working with Nazis while he was in a POW camp during the war. A propaganda arm formed which sought to spin the rebellion as pro-Soviet and the guards as Beryaites. The prisoners mass-produced weapons in the camp's workshops and even made grenades, explosives, and Molotov cocktails. They built barricades and kept buckets of crushed glass that could be thrown into the soldiers' eyes. They even managed to build a makeshift radio station. Even after the guards cut off electricity, they used a water tap to create a hydroelectric power station and built a radio from portable film projectors. "Comrade soldiers," one radio program began, "we are not afraid of you, and we ask you not come into our zone. Don't shoot at us. Don't buckle under the wall of the Beryaites." They sent pamphlets out of the camp by pigeon. Order and cleanliness was high, according to one inmate. Prisoners cooked, rationed their food, and washed clothes. One memoir described a Polish aristocrat opening a cafe and made something resembling coffee. They had lectures and concerts and even put on a play. One religious sect claimed that a prophet had predicted the tearing down of the wall and that now they would all be taken to heaven. Imprisoned priests performed marriages. None of the prisoners' reports suggested that any sexual assault occurred during the uprising. A hymn was written, which the prisoners sang together. We will not be slaves. We will not carry the yoke any longer," went the refrain. Sergei Yegorov, head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which is formerly the NKVD, arrived to be a part of the negotiations. The prisoners had a list of demands, including the guards who killed prisoners to be charged, a reduction of their sentences, the removal of punishment cells, more communication with their relatives, to be allowed to go home when they were released and not remain in exile, and for the men and women's camps to remain open to each other. Some demands were even agreed to, including the establishment of an 8-hour workday and for some hated guards to be transferred. By June 15th, however, Moscow was running out of patience, and tanks and troops were on their way. In the days leading up to the attack, they tested the camp's defenses and took pictures of the prisoners as they stood in position to identify those who participated. On June 26th, the MVD attacked the camp with at least 1,700 soldiers, 98 dogs, and 5 T-34 tanks. Prisoners who want to cooperate are asked to leave the camp quietly, a voice said over the loudspeakers. Prisoners who resist will be shot. I stood in the middle, said one inmate, and all around me tanks crushed living people. The barracks were destroyed with people still inside. The prisoners tried to resist, but against heavily armed soldiers. Within an hour and a half, the camp had been pacified. According to official reports, 37 prisoners were killed and 9 more died of their wounds. 106 were wounded, along with 40 soldiers. The prisoners remembered the casualties differently. The camp doctor would remember 500 dead. 436 prisoners were arrested, and the members of the strike committee were executed. Kuznetsov was spared. He prepared a long confession, which implicated many of the other prisoners. The exact identities of those in the center were never certainly discovered. The 40 days of Kengir, as Solzhenitsyn dubbed it, were bloody, but did help to speed the end of the Gulag system. Though they were meant to be self-supporting, the camps were actually extremely unprofitable. A survey of the Gulag's finances in June 1954 showed that the system was heavily subsidized. In a meeting after Kengir, Gulag personnel complained about poor organization and bureaucracy. Strikes and resistance within the camps continued. In July of 1954, rules were relaxed. Prisoners were allowed to write letters, and some prisoners were even allowed to live with their spouses. Khrushchev gave his secret speech in 1956, where he attacked Stalin for the first time. 617,000 people were rehabilitated and released in the 10 months following that speech. While the Gulag administration was dissolved in 1960, various kinds of work camps for political prisoners continued on for decades. One of the most notorious of those, Perm 36, wasn't shut down until 1987. The Kengir Uprising is an example of a brief moment of humanity rising in a horrible situation that was snuffed out all too quickly. One prisoner later said, "I had never before, nor have I since, felt such a sense of freedom as I did then." And as important as the Kengir Uprising was in bringing down the Gulag system, it might well have become forgotten history. It would probably be entirely unknown in the West, were it not for the 1973 publication of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.